Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.
Garza. And so we have a few minute delay, so I'll just let Dr. Garza kind of introduce himself. He has his own channel, and go ahead and tell people about yourself.
Well, my name is Al Garza. I have a Ph.D. in biblical studies, basically in the Jewish Second Temple Jewish literature, rabbinic studies. I've been in ministry for over 30 years now. I have my own channel, Bible Answers Unfiltered, and also Black Belt Theology. I've been involved in apologetics. I've been involved in manuscript and manuscript studies of Hebrew New Testament manuscripts. Been doing some translation work. Again, just 30 years of academic experience, ministry with different areas within, apologetics and just online stuff. So I've written a number of books, written over 30 books that you can find online. A number of them ranging from different topics of the Trinity, on Satan, on the deity of the Messiah, commentaries on different Gospels and the New Testament writings. So just a wide span, which you can kind of find online or at my website.
Yeah. And so I found your channel. I was doing research on Hebrew and trying to understand some of the Hebrew New Testament and Revelation and things like that. And then I came across your channel, contacted you. And then for those people who don't know, we talked for, I don't know, the first time we talked, it was like 3 hours, 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
We were just like talking about all sorts of stuff. It was really fun. I had a great time. But I asked him to come on my channel because I had proposed a theory, and I wanted him to take a look at it and see what he thought about this theory. It involves Daniel 12:11, and we're talking about the abomination of desolation. And I sent you kind of how I had taken the Hebrew and we'll go off and we'll talk about a lot of other things as we talked about initially, but I just kind of wanted you to kind of talk to me and to those out there what you thought about how I had exegeted that Hebrew or had kind of translated the Hebrew, and specifically with that lamed. So if you don't mind to go ahead and
Well, if you can you summarize with that? Because I know there was some people, I guess, that were in our discussion, and summarize where you were going with that, and how you were looking at it. Because I know that you had a different look on it, or a translation that was based on what you thought was, you know with the Hebrew, which pretty much it was. And I think if you want to kind of elaborate on that, kind of explain that, give more
sure.
detail.
I'm gonna switch over. I had prepared this
Yeah.
slide so people could see. So this is what I had originally put in there, and I apologize your face isn't on the here, but if you look right here on this initial slide on the whiteboard, I had this lamed, this two is not generally translated in most translations. And so I had basically said that the from time was from the removal of the sacrifice and the burnt offering to the abomination of desolation, which was then 1290 days. So they gave us a time frame of from and to, and that most people were interpreting these events as happening at the exact same time. That the Tamid, the sacrifice was taken away at the same time that the abominations occurred. But based on my reading of it and that Hebrew, I thought they were separated by 1290 days. Does that summarize?
Yeah, yeah, and I think, and I think and I don't think you could be. I don't think any scholar has different variants of interpretation on this, even based on the Hebrew or how they translate it. I mean, to
I'm
divide
not talking
it,
about I'm not
yeah,
talking about the interpretation. I'm just talking
okay,
about just the translation.
right. And the
Well,
translation syntactically is I would have no problem with that, because
okay.
in Hebrew, when you have prefixes and how they utilize, they can either be dropped or they can be used. It just depends on the context or on the translator themselves. Hebrew scholars you'll find, based on how they would read the passage, they might use the lamed, they might not use the lamed, they might use different prefixes. If you have, even with vavs and all that, they might put it in, even with a definite article. You might have the hey in there, and the hey might be not even being utilized in the translation as the. So that does happen, and again, it's based on the discrepancy of the translators themselves and how they want to translate the passage. So you might look at it and say, oh, look, there's a lamed there, it's not translated. I might see a passage, hey, look, there's a hey in there, it's not translated. And I've seen that a number of times as well. They don't put the in there, maybe because it doesn't flow correctly or doesn't connect the passage the way they want. So it becomes more of how the translators want to utilize sometimes prefixes and suffixes. I have seen many times where the adjectives and verbs are plural, but they translated the passage in a singular way,
Yeah.
and that sometimes bothers me. So
I
this is a
was just looking
discrepancy.
at the Day of Atonements, Kippurim, and many times when Kippurim is translated just singular Day of Atonement versus where it actually says Day of Atonements
Hmm.
in some of those passages. So I completely understand what you're saying there. So
Yeah, so there's going to be it's because it's going to be basically how the translators want to translate, interpret the text. And that's why I said interpretation, because the translators are going to translate based on how they understand and how they interpret the passage. So that's why I meant the interpretation, because that's basically what it comes down to, is how why they didn't or why they did use it. It's just like in other places. It's how they view the text and how they understand it and how they interpret it. So that's where the discrepancy can come in.
sure, and we're going to talk about the interpretation
Mhm.
here in just a second because we talked about your view, because your view of eschatology is not the same as my view of eschatology, and we had a very long discussion on that as well. That was very fun. So you would you have a problem with how I translated that by
No,
putting that two in there?
not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
Okay. All
Not at
right.
all.
So that was my first question. I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing something with the text that was not allowed or that was, you know, uh, I didn't want to do damage or violence to the
No,
text,
and I think
basically.
I think I think it's great that you put these things out there like that, because like I said, I come across passages where, again, articles aren't put in, but it's in the Hebrew. And I think, why didn't they put the in there for to specifically identify what it's saying rather than leaving it without the article? So if it's in the Hebrew and it's there and you want to utilize it as a prefix and it's not the English, then I would relate back to the Hebrew like you did, and you can use it from to and so forth. And there's other ways, but yeah, there was really no problem with how you did that.
Okay. So, and then we were talking about the interpretation. Um, if you don't mind just talking a little bit about your perspective of your understanding of eschatology. I know we talked about it that you take
Yeah.
a little bit different view than what I take. So if you don't, so let me ask you this: how would you, if we were talking about the abomination of desolation and we talked about it in Matthew 24, and your view is, well, why don't you just tell people what your view is related to the abomination of desolation and time frame wise?
Yeah, the abomination that brings desolation, or for me, going back to the Old Testament, which will interpret the New Testament, even in Daniel 11, you have in Daniel 9, Daniel 11, Daniel 12, you have the understanding of abomination. Even in verse 31, they will set up the abomination of desolation, looking back to Antiochus and bringing that end of sacrifices. So for me, eschatology deals with the repeat of history upon Israel. If you read, the from Leviticus 26, the blessing and curses, you see
Mhm.
those things with, that when the God's people disobeys them, there's going to be curses, there's going to be famine, plagues, pestilence, they're going to be exiled. Nations are going to put them into exile, put them with the sword, cast them out.
And
And
then
that's,
that's the one
yeah,
where it's multiplied 7 times, right?
yeah,
So where it becomes
exactly. The
more
intensity,
multiplied, the
intensity,
intensity
right.
multiplies. Yes.
Right, and you
Okay.
see that all through the writings of the prophets, Isaiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, minor prophets, Hosea. You see them describing these events at the time that they're writing, either right before or even after going back and describing it. And it's horrific. And if you read Lamentations, you see how horrific it was, from the mothers eating their children, cannibalism, all these things. So these things have always intensified against Israel, and this is what you see in the Hebrew scriptures, because again, the prophets are writing to the people of Israel and Judah. So you see this theme throughout the Old Testament, and it doesn't change even with Daniel when he sees his visions. For me, I see Daniel giving the same vision of what's to happen in the future after the Messiah is put to death by Israel, by his own people, by the leaders, which brings out even more of the curses upon Israel. And this is what you see in the New Testament, the urgency to reach to the Jewish people, to the Jew first. That's why I think from Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, you see these descriptions for me, the same wording found in Leviticus 26 and in the prophets, these same wordings of fire, pestilence, plague, sword, nation. And sometimes they use Jewish apocalyptic imagery, which is common. So I see this taking place all throughout the New Testament, all throughout the book of Acts. Paul writes about it in some of his letters and gives some brief descriptions of it. Revelation, is thematic flow, is based on that. That's why John references the Old Testament, and he references those passages that I mentioned all throughout the book of Revelation. So for me, I see it as a divorce of Israel, as Kenneth Gentry Jr. might put it, Israel's divorce from God. I agree with him on that this is something historical. Now, I would definitely say that there's going to be a literal return of the Messiah. In Jewish thought of the first century, the resurrection takes place when the Messiah comes. Now, for some unbelieving Jews, it's a first coming in their mind. For us who are believers, it's a second coming where he will return and bring the resurrection of the dead, as Jesus speaks of in John 5, and Paul speaks of it. You see it in the book of Acts. All these areas where the resurrection takes place and then the end is all over, where everything is made whole again. So I don't, there's a lot of theoretical interpretations that you're going to see with, dispensationalism and pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, amil, all these things, but I try to stay away from all that. I used to be involved in it really heavily in my early years, until I started really digging into the Jewish culture and context of the scriptures and the language, and then none of that made any sense to me anymore once I started reading it the way it was written for that time. And so now I see it as, I don't put anything theoretically into it. I just say, look, we're waiting for the second coming of the Messiah to bring about the resurrection, and then that's it. It's all over. Jesus will make everything whole and new again. And how that happens, it could take place in many different ways, but the resurrection for me is the final end of all things. And I think that was a Jewish perspective in the first century. You find that in many of their writings. We find that in Dead Sea Scroll writings. It's in different intertestamental writings, and you find that even the New Testament, that is what they were going to be waiting for, was the resurrection of the dead, the perfection of all things at that moment, and then that was it.
Yeah, that's great explanation. Thank you. So from the perspective of what we might call partial preterists, is that a fair usage just for people's, or is yours more nuanced than that?
Um,
I don't want to put
yeah.
words in your mouth.
No, and yeah, the term preterist, and there's different ones of full preterism, partial preterism. Again, these are labels, obviously, that come later to identify certain categories of thinking. I try to stay with just first century Jewish thinking, first century
Okay.
Jewish thought. That
Okay.
goes back to the Eastern understanding of how Jews understood end times. Now, people can label that, put the label on that later. That's fine, but people will probably categorize other people and how they preterist, well, that means this or that, and I know not necessarily in my position, even though I have a historical position. It goes back to first century Judaism and how they understood it. Specifically Paul, who was a Pharisee, and he came out of a specific house, the house of Hillel. He was at the feet of Gamaliel. Their view of the resurrection, how things would take place, is where I focus on. And I say, okay, how did they understand end times or messianic views of resurrection? And that's where I get into more of.
Okay. So in terms of talking about the abomination of desolation, which is what we kind of started with in Daniel 12:11, that would have happened in the first century, based on the Jewish apocalyptic literature of how people viewed that, and
Well,
it was a
yeah. Well, I would
was that a
say
more of a literal or a figurative type
I would
of?
say it's something that's happened pretty much at the destruction of the temple every time. So whether you're talking about Antiochus and their destruction, how he did it described in Daniel, or the Romans, I think this is a description that takes place against Israel when they disobey God and God brings judgment. The abomination of desolation, it's just a way of phrasing the temple will be desecrated. They're going to
Mhm.
set up pagan imageries, pig sacrifices, things that's going to bring abomination to God's holy place. and desecrate it, and of course they're going to destroy it. So if you look at like I said, it's a repeat of history. So these are literal things that happen. Again, the context will always talk about the abomination of desolation, or the abomination of horrors that come, and then you see Leviticus 26 verses coming in, prophets of sword, famine, pestilence, all these things that will come upon the people with that description. So for me, it's literal, historical, it's repeated, and it's a warning that this is what's going to take place and what's going to happen when you disobey God and you walk away from the commandments. So that's how I look at
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
So let me ask you. So if for some reason, I mean, you see, what's going on in the news right now, and
Yes.
I'm not a news, like, that's not what I'm focused on. But let's say, for example, that the temple was rebuilt, or that um the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, was rebuilt. Could that type of abomination then occur again? Could this foreshadow something also in the future, this abomination of desolation? Or and would you be, or do you think that this has already happened and this can't yet happen again? Am I
Oh,
making the
good, great
question
question.
clear?
Yeah, no, great question. I've always been under the impression from the New Testament that the temple won't be rebuilt to bring sacrifices.
Okay.
Now, could it be rebuilt? Sure, I could be wrong. If it was being rebuilt and it got to be rebuilt, even part of it enough to bring sacrifices, then I would look at this as a possible. These things can happen again. Israel is not a godly nation. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
you do have Orthodox Judaism there, which are unbelieving rabbinic Orthodox that don't really want Christians there, even though there are thousands of Messianic Jews and Christians there. The leadership of Israel is not. They don't believe in Yeshua Jesus, so it's not really a people of of God in the sense of the New Testament of what needs. Now, God, of course, has a different plan for Israel, even for an unbelieving nation. So, can God do it again? Of course, He can do whatever He wants. If He wants to bring punishment against Israel again for their disobedience, He can. Does that mean He can definitely do that with the temple and do it again? Of course. Do I see that in Scripture? I think in my position, I don't really see it that way as far as being rebuilt. And I think if you read the book of Hebrews carefully and other passages in Revelation, I don't see God allowing that to happen. But could He? Of
Okay.
course, I could be wrong. But again, I don't see that in the Scripture.
Yeah, I appreciate your balance there, and how you. So let me go back and look at this, what we just talked about in Daniel 11, and you seeing how these abominations and these desolations of Jerusalem and the abominations that have occurred in the temple over and over. Do you see how Daniel 12:11, the one we just talked about, where we talk about the 1290 days, and then the 1335 days where there's a blessing? Do you see that you're very familiar with the Old Testament? Do you see that having occurred at some point in time? Is that a prophecy that's already been fulfilled in your mind, or have you not looked at that closely, or just kind of what's your take on that? Oh, did I lose you? Did I lose your?
You got me there? Am
Yep,
I
I
good?
gotcha.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Sorry. I guess it wasn't clicked on blinking because when I cough, I muted it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. There are various interpretations to these passages. Scholars debate on this because, again, this is based possibly on a Jewish calendar perspective, the days
Yes.
and so forth. So it's hard to tell because they can be off on certain times. This is 3.5 years plus an extra so many months or an extra so many days. But I think part of this has to do with, for me, dealing with not, I wouldn't say end time prophecies, but I would say more towards prophecies of what's to come against Israel. Again, the Jewish war, which took place 3.5 years, and what given some time frame. Again, Jewish calendar wise, you have scholars say this happened exactly to the month and day of these things within a 3.5 year period, which gives you sometimes here 3.5 years, maybe an extra month or even an extra 2 months, extra days. So I would say, based on my notes that I've taken on this many times before, these are events that would happen even contributing to the time of Antiochus versus also, again, God's timing against Israel in Matthew 24, dealing with 70 AD and the description of what's to come. So, number wise, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly because, again, Jewish calendar got lost at some point and it had to be
Hmm.
restored. And even the restoration of it is not, many scholars believe, is not exact the way it was held prior. So
Sure.
there could be discrepancies among days and times.
So what you're saying is that 1,290 days would have been about a 3.5 year time period, that each 30 days was kind of the old Jewish calendar of what most people think. And that the Jewish war, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that 3.5 years that led up to it would somewhat fit that 1,290 days. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Even on the calendar Jewish date, it's almost to the exact day and month and day, obviously, and that they pinpoint it. So yes, because it fits the 3.5 years that happened prior. They can look at now. Again, the Jewish calendar dealt with seasons, times, and seasons. Not really like the what we have today. We use the Roman calendar, a different calendar, so it's like not 30 days how we look at this sometimes, but times and seasons. Excuse me, gotta clear my throat. But times and seasons, how the Jews would have looked at it. Man, I need water.
Yeah, no problem. I'm getting you to talk a lot. Like last
Yeah,
time, I was just like,
yeah.
I kept pestering you with questions, and you just like, you were just
Yeah,
asking.
my
You were
throat gets a little dry, and then I have to like drink. Yeah, you get to clear it up. But yeah, going back, yeah. So it's hard because where we go with days and times, we look at it from one perspective, how they lived it and saw it there with seasons, 24-hour periods, and the new moons. It's a little bit different. So that's what most scholars don't try to give. Oh, here it is, 335 days, 1290, and they try to go exact because again, the calendar seasons changed. So a lot of it was lost, had to be restored. So there could be some gaps in there that haven't been filled in. But the time frame for the New Testament is 3.5 years, which is prophetic from the Old Testament of the same time
Mhm.
frame, given the Jewish calendar they were using of the month and even to the time of that season. So it was pretty exact. So I would look at it from my perspective as being that was fulfilled at 70, leading up to
Sure.
that 3.5 years, and then 70, and then from that point on.
Okay. So, and I can totally see that. I can get my mind around it. That makes sense. That in 70 AD you had that event where the city was destroyed. Let me ask you the next one when we talk about in Daniel 12:12, where it says, though, after 1,335 days, that there will be a blessing. So, in that type of thought process, what might that blessing have been at that time? Because that's always been one that's kind of I've struggled with because if it's going to be something that happened in 70 AD, I don't see any blessing that occurred either right after this event or 3.5 years after the temple was destroyed.
Well, I guess it would have to be looked at as being how people view that destruction, because that was the curse of God that brought restoration and brought Israel to a point of needed prophecy. And the Jews understood this even afterwards, looking back, saying that was a time that was fulfilled by Daniel, that 70 AD. Now, they won't tell you why, because they won't get into the real details like a lot of Christians would regarding to the Messiah. But this is something that brings the blessings. Some people look at it like this was something that brought the gospel message now through the whole world. After that, it was no longer just there in Israel. There, it was actually opened up to the nations, and that's where you see the church really exploding throughout the world. From the early church, the Greek and Latin fathers, going down to the Reformation, all the way into where we are today, which was huge because it was no longer limited to a certain place. And if you read the Book of Acts, you see the restrictions they have. The apostles had, were being, beaten and thrown in prison. And so, a lot of times, interpreters might look at this as a restoration of the coming Messiah, or the inauguration of the Messianic kingdom that took place right after that, because it's no longer just put there in Israel as that was their punishment, and therefore now the gospel was opened up to the world. And so and that's kind of what you see, obviously, to me, because that's where we come from today, was from that moment on. Where back
Okay.
there they were limited to Israel. Paul would go out to different synagogues because they knew their time was short. They knew that this was going to happen. Paul would have known with certainty, based on even the descriptions from the apostles, from Jesus himself, and knowing the Torah as he would have known they had within that generation, their Israel was going to be judged. So this is why I think the urgency in the book of Acts would have been to reach the Jew first, reach the Hellenized Jews, try to bring the gospel message, and of course, after that, bring it also to the nations, which did happen, unfortunately, even after, because Christians outside of Israel, believers who were not Jews, weren't affected by that. It was basically isolated to Israel. Rome surrounded it. They kept them there 3.5 years, starved them. All the things that described in the Old Testament happened. But Christians outside of that weren't the ones being persecuted. It was the Jews. So Christians at that point were still able to, in different parts of the world, in Alexandria, in Egypt, still bring out the gospel message, and that's where we start to see the Greek translations of the text coming out throughout that period and go beyond. So, I mean, we could say people might say, is that a blessed thing to happen, implying that the gospel now reach the nations and go all that? You could say yes, and the fulfillment of the prophecy against Israel. Um, it's kind of a twofold thing there. It's kind of really hard to answer.
So, yeah. Well, you had talked about how this was much of what you see, the apocalyptic literature is more of a first century type of view. Do you think that then that they misunderstood what this blessing entailed, and that there was some type of they missed of it going to the Gentiles and the other nations, and so maybe their first century view wasn't completely, they didn't have a full understanding of everything that was going to happen. Is that what you're saying
For
there?
who? When you say them,
For,
what are you
for the
referring to?
Jews. So if we're looking at this 1335 days is
Mhm.
tied to the abomination of desolation, right? After 1335 days of the abomination desolation, there's going to be a blessing in
Well,
Daniel
yeah,
12.
it says the ones who wait for and reaches the end of the 1335 days.
Mhm.
So I mean, it doesn't. I mean, if I look at it to what it says in the text, how blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the days, and in some translations it actually puts it into as far as reaches to the end of those days, implies there's something that's going to happen afterward. Doesn't tell you it's again, it doesn't tell you time frame exactly for me as far as
Right.
okay, how far could it be, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years, what is it that exactly is going to happen, who keeps waiting and attains to that time frame.
Right.
So people would say, well, okay, yeah, given that time frame, that extra few months afterward, then again, I think for me, I don't try to.
It's a lot of speculation, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's a lot of I
Really?
call it theoretical interpretations.
Yeah.
There's a lot of theoretical interpretations. I just hold to what we know happened, what did happen. Some of it can be attributed to the time frame based on what we know the calendar date wise, and there could be some gaps or some missing areas in there that were because of the translations, because of the calendar, that we can't exactly get into that much detail. I mean, we could again theoretically and speculate and give interpretations on that, but I try to stay away from that because it, there's a point where we have to say, okay, don't really know exactly what it's referring to the detail, but I can say
Right.
we know this happened, and that happened historically, and we know what happened afterward. What we're going to say beyond that is, I think, theoretical interpretation.
Okay. All right. And from your study of Old Testament and
Apocalyptic.
thank you.
Yeah.
Apocalyptic literature, you don't see anything that also mentions what that blessing might have been. Because I know I've looked and looked and looked, and I really struggle to find anything that suggests of what that blessing might be.
Yeah, I mean, I would venture to say that for me, if you read the New Testament carefully with the what was supposed to take place and the understanding that the nations would be grafted in, all and all Israel will be saved at one point, that we have to look at like, is that a blessing? Now, the word blessed, if depending how you translate it from the Hebrew, means also, if you look at from the blessed are those from the Gospel of Matthew, it's really happy are those. It could mean happy. It doesn't really mean like bless, like, oh, I'm going to bless you, like the way we think of it, but it means a happy. It could also refer to that, which is used in the New Testament in the Hebrew quite a bit. So happy are those that attain that. So that happiness could be also looked at again, the gospel going out to the nations. It's no longer isolated into one space. That's why the apostles, for me, question I had, they never left Israel, Jerusalem. They stayed at the temple. They were there daily, reaching the Jews. They never left all that. They never went out. Even when they were persecuted and a lot of their followers went, they stayed.
Mm.
So you got to understand why didn't they ever go out beyond that? Only Paul was the one that went out synagogue to synagogue and reached Hebrew Jews, Greek Jews, and of course Gentiles, non-Jews. So, but they stayed, and I think that was the importance of understanding. They knew what was going to happen. Jesus had already explained to them from the scriptures who he was, and I believe also what was about to come upon them as a people, as a nation. And I think that's where they were there to try and reach as many of them as they could. So how you look at blessed or looked at happiness or that joy of what's going to happen after or up to that point of the 70 and beyond, I think can be looked at a number of different ways. For me, it's just the gospel now being released to the world and released to the nations, which was supposed to happen anyway according to the New Testament, or reaching the Gentiles or the nations beyond Israel, beyond the Jews. And I don't think that could have happened without God having to punish Israel for what they did. And I think that was the plan, is that, of course, the curses happened, predicted by Moses, by God to Moses, and then boom, repeat history again, warnings from the prophets. They killed the Messiah, they persecuted, they killed him, turned him over to Pontius Pilate. He would, so all these things happened as accordance to the plan of God. And then, of course, Jesus tells his disciples, this is what's going to happen again. They're going to be surrounded. They're going to go through all this, exactly what you find in the Old Testament. And then, of course, it's going to go to the nations. It's going to go to the world. And I think that's what we find. And I think that's, for me, a more consistent understanding or interpretation of the text from a historical perspective.
Okay. Continuing our discussion of the abomination desolation, do you think that there can be an abomination of desolation that is separate from just the desolation of Jerusalem? So, what I'm thinking of and what I'm considering, we've talked about this. It's Matthew 24, where it talks about the abomination of desolation, and Luke 21 talks about the desolation of Jerusalem. And we talked about how the abomination of desolation it was a type, at least in my mind, of Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 AD. Wait, BC. Um, do you think that those could be that you could have a desolation of Jerusalem without an abomination of desolation? And do you think that you could have an abomination of desolation without desolation of Jerusalem itself? Or do you think that those have to occur together?
I think for that to happen, I think you would have to find that. To me, it's more of a stretch for me, because there is a systematic language approach to this, as far as how it's used and how you find it in the Old Testament. And when you find these places in Matthew and in Luke, and even later on Luke 21, he even talks about, again, the sword, the famine, the fire. It plays a historical vision or view that they would have understand. This is the language that they would have heard and understood, going back to the prophets, going back to Daniel, going back to Leviticus 26. Something that people that would have definitely understood. Okay, this is going to happen. Like we talk about World War One, World War Two, and we talk about World War Three. So we connect these wars from the past to what's happening in the present, simply by someone told you, oh, World War Three could happen. In your mind, you're thinking, well, there's definitely World War One, World War Two, World War Three could be. I mean, they connect this language just the same way of saying, okay, yeah, Isaiah, the prophet Daniel, abomination of desolation, the temple being destroyed. We have our. I mean, they see it firsthand in front of them, and they know what Moses spoke of in Leviticus 20 in Leviticus 26. So it's a common understanding that they would have triggered. They would have known what Jesus was talking about in its historical context about to come within that generation, because he's giving them heads up. and I think it's giving him warning that this is going to happen after his death and resurrection within that generation. So I think they would have understood that terminology in connection with. Now us, like you were saying, you can possibly, you'd have to show and take it out of its meaning in the text and have to show it in a different way. And I mean, I would look for sources, different citations, early church, how they, Jewish sources, how they would have taken it differently or a different way. Then I guess you can kind of see it that way and say it implies in different areas, possibly. But I haven't found that. I've always found that the Jews have interpreted these things as far as what Daniel, what happened to them in 70, and that was it.
Sure. So let me. So you say, you mentioned how the Jews interpret it in the first century and 70, but yet when we talked about the blessing, that was not a standard Jewish interpretation in the first century. When we talk about the 1335 days of blessing, and was much more of a Christianized type of context.
Well,
So
I
do you?
did. The Jews. Let me correct that. First
Okay.
century. I'm talking about Jews later on, looking back, fourth, fifth
Oh, okay.
century, Talmudic writings, rabbinic writings, looking back at 70,
Okay.
recognizing that this is fulfilled. These were the fulfillments of Daniel. You do find it in the Talmud and other Jewish sources that reflect that 70 is the fulfillment of Daniel and the
Sure.
time frame. And again, the 3.5 years, those days that we looked at within the 1290 and 1335 days, they connect those things of that time. So it's not first century. It's hindsight looking back, realizing why it happened.
But wouldn't we agree that the Jews looking back still don't understand the first coming of Christ? And we changed that blessing in the 1335 to a Christianized understanding. And much of the first coming of Messiah was transformed into a Christian understanding. And even the Talmudic writers and the people that were looking back didn't quite understand everything that was going on. Do you think that that might be the same thing with some of the
Um,
other events that are occurring?
I when we say they didn't understand fully, I would say nobody did. Even the first century, even the apostles didn't understand things that Jesus had to do and things. Jews debated over the Messiah in their writings and in their synagogues, and they played a major role as far as how they viewed the Messiah. They rejected Jesus or Yeshua Jesus as the Messiah, but they knew things the Messiah had to do. And there was
Okay,
always
fair.
there are always controversies, of course, how they saw two messiahs. One has to die, one has to do this, and they didn't know how to reconcile. But they understood that there had to be these different roles or actions the Messiah had to play. Now, again, just like we talk about eschatology and we say, "Oh, these things have to happen," this, we won't know until it happens.
Right.
And that's kind of how they understood the Messiah. We read these things about the Messiah. He has to do this, but look, Messiah here, look, he dies. Well, why does he die? Well, over here it says he's this. He has to come back. He has to do this. He has to go to heaven. He has to send here and come back. They didn't know. They couldn't create a time frame that we see in the New Testament because it hadn't happened. Just like we don't put dates in our eschatology. We don't, I
Right.
mean, some people do, and when it fails, you see that.
Oh,
But
and it wrecks people, it wrecks
yes,
some people faith
yes,
and things like that. I don't like when people do that.
right. So
So
with the unbelieving rap, that's why you have Messianic Jews who they'll tell you the story on how they came to be believing Jews now in Yeshua Jesus by looking at the prophecies and looking at Jesus as fulfilling them and seeing these things historically. But then you have Jews who just continue to debate the issue of how Messiah was going to do these things, but they will not acknowledge it as being Jesus or Yeshua. So their Messiah view is correct, and what the parts are there. The puzzle pieces are there. They just haven't put them together yet. Some have. Obviously, there are a lot of Messianic Jews in Israel and outside of that. So yes, a lot of them have. But more of the Orthodox Jews who are more religious and don't believe in the Christianity, don't believe in Jesus and Yeshua, they still have the pieces of the Messiah. They just haven't connected them yet. Just like we have pieces of eschatology of what we think things are going to happen, but we can't put them together and see the exact picture because it hasn't happened yet. We just see, we know this could happen, we know that could happen, we know he will return, we know that there will be a resurrection, but we can't say, oh, this is when this is going to happen, and look, and create this timeline, because that's where I think we get into trouble.
Do
And
you,
a lot
do
of
you think we
Christians do.
you think we can't create a timeline, or do you think we can't create time year in terms of, like, we can set up a chronology of events that might occur in order, but
Might. You said might. See, that's
right,
my point.
yeah, yeah,
Might. You have one, another person has theirs, another scholar has his. These are all, again, theoretical interpretations that I'm saying, and you said it right. Might. That is the issue. You can't say definitely this is going to happen and bet your life on it.
I
No
agree.
one will do that. That's why I said we have the pieces. We know Jesus resurrected. We know he will return. We know there'll be a resurrection because the scriptures are plainly clear on that. But we can't put that in a picture of our own and say, well, let me create this picture puzzle and say, this is exactly how it's all going to take place until this point. Because that's where it becomes, you say, it might happen this way, might, because then you're dealing with many views and interpretations that, who says they're not right, who says they're not, who says. That's why, because the theoretical interpretations of eschatology is, to me, I try to stay out of. I can only give you what, like the Jews did, see the pieces of what's going to happen before it happens, that we see, okay, are definite. Like I said, the Jews saw the Messiah a certain way, and they debated on when the Messiah came. The ones that believed understood the picture. Now they saw it in Jesus, especially after the resurrection. We have the eschatology pieces, and we're trying to force it into our own picture in a timeline that I believe we can't put in yet. But I think we'll see when it happens. Obviously, we're going to look back and say that, okay, now we get it. But I don't think we can do that yet. We just still have the pieces, and we're trying to make sense of it, like they did about the Messiah, and we debate about them like they debated about the Messiah before Jesus. And even today, when they're debating about the Messiah without looking at Jesus, they're still doing the same exact thing that we can do with eschatology.
Okay. I just got something in chat that somebody said they can't hear you. Hold on a second. Let me just do something real quick. No, I can hear you. That's not the issue. I can hear you. Um, I'm thinking that I'm wondering if there's something with YouTube and what I had set up. Um, shoot. Hopefully everything is recorded with the volume.
Can you ask, can anybody else hear me, or is everybody else can't hear me at all?
Yeah, the couple of people can't hear you at all. Um,
Oh, at all?
no, I just flipped a button too. Um, is that better? And I think they said it pretty early, and I just missed the chat. I've been so focused on talking to you, I wasn't even paying attention to chat.
Uh oh.
Um, yeah, go ahead and just say something again if you
How
don't
about
care.
now? Test. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Or
I don't know if they might have
yeah.
dropped out, so
Oh no.
they couldn't hear me. Yeah, that'd really be frustrating.
Well, I hope you don't
Um,
upload it and then there's no volume on my side.
that'd be what I'd really, yeah, that'd be what
uh,
I'd really be upset about.
yeah.
If recorded, I'll be back to listen. Still can't hear. Okay. All right. Thank you, Celine, for letting me know. I'm so sorry.
Can they
Shoot.
hear me now? Okay.
Um, no. I tried to hit something else. So, and this was, this is why I should have tested this way a long time ago, and that's my fault. Um, all right. I won't. Here's what I don't want to keep you too long, and none of this winds up being able to hear anything, and I'd hate for us to have a whole discussion. It's edifying to me, but if I can't share it with everybody else,
I
then
know.
that's not
Well, I'm
accomplishing one
doing
of
I'm
my
doing a
goals.
screen recording myself, so I'm hoping it does come
Are you?
out. Yeah. So
Okay.
I'm hoping, even on my part, I can have it all comes out, because if I post it as well, then hopefully at least it can be heard. So I have to test mine out too, my screen recording, make sure everything's recorded correctly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll text you if mine winds up not working. So hopefully, I should have just that's what I should have done. I should have hit my record on my XSplit broadcaster. Darn it. I should have done that. I'll
Okay.
know for next time.
Yeah.
Um, so um regarding so again, still talking about the abomination, we were I lost track of where we were at. Um, can you remind me what you
Yeah,
were
we,
just
we were
talking about?
discussing about the third. You were kind of trying to see if we could go beyond the days of a future. I think it was where it's because I was kind of getting into that the time frames and how we look at pieces. And you talk about create a timeline. Can we create a timeline, or can we do this? And I was saying not to the point where you were saying we might have that. So that I kind of put you on that of you said you might we might be able to see things, and I said that was my point is we can't know for sure. We can
Sure.
only speculate, give again theoretical interpretations, and that's all where it ends up until that time comes. We can only see the pieces of the puzzle that we know for us to be true.
So in regards to that, if we take that this abomination happened in the past and there's no current temple or sacrifices, besides the return of Jesus in the future, do you see any other events that that you see that should happen or that will you think will happen, regardless of order of those events? Do you see anything like that in the future?
For me, I don't. I am simply seeing and awaiting the second coming, the resurrection of the dead, and all things brought new. That's all I'm waiting for. I look at what's going around the world as maybe signals or red flags of where we're heading that could, escalate things and maybe bring about the return at a certain point, or maybe not. Maybe it could be another cycle of we go into a turmoil and then things turn around and we have a certain time of non-terminal turmoil, and then all of a sudden given the fact that we can see this throughout our history of the different things that have happened, even going into the dark ages and Europe and what they went through. People thought this is it, it's all over,
Mhm.
half the
Right.
population is dead. I mean, I think we can go through things that are resemble the past of God's bringing certain judgments to a nation or people, and then having good prosperity times, and then flipping. So that's what I'm saying. It's hard because living back then, we would have been thinking, "Oh my gosh, it's the end of the world." Again, all these things are happening, and especially in parts of Europe. And then we come to the U.S., we have all these wars, World War One and Two, and the Spanish flu, and all these. We're thinking, man, this is it, this is it, and people they've used that as a springboard to put dates down, and many false religions came out of that. So I can say I don't want to cycle anything more than that or recycle and try to put things like that again. And my position is I'm awaiting, for me personally, every day. The Lord can return at any moment. He can return today, this minute, this second, or tomorrow, or 100 years from now if He chooses. So I am only doing what I'm supposed to be doing according to His calling, and then I'm just awaiting His return when He wants to come. If He doesn't come in my lifetime and I pass, then okay, then next generation comes up. So I'm just doing what I'm supposed to be doing and just waiting patiently until He decides to return.
Okay. Very, very good. I have some other questions here. How much time were you, was an
Oh, I still
hour
got,
enough?
yeah, I still have some. If you want to go under 10, 15 minutes, I think that'd be good.
Okay, great. So they're interesting. I just actually watched one of your videos on fate and self. It was really interesting. It was fate and I'm trying to remember the
Free
title.
will.
And anyways, you talk about a lot of different topics.
Yeah,
So
fate and
I
free
could go
will, I
off
think it
into
was.
yeah, free will. Yes, I could go off into a lot of different things. But let me ask you a few other things related to the language that we because one of the really interesting things that I enjoyed when we were talking before was the language about coming on the clouds, and we were talking about the judgment language that we saw in Matthew 24. So if we were talking about this abomination of desolation in Matthew 24, and then it talked about this great tribulation, it talked about signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and then it talked about you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. This language here, and then he'll send out his angels and gather his elect.
Right.
Um, and can you talk a little bit about the cloud motif? Because actually, that's what I'm going to be talking about on Saturday on my live stream on Saturday. Is this the cloud idea and the cloud motif? Do you
Okay.
mind explaining a little bit?
Yeah, well, cloud motif, it goes back even before Daniel and other pagan cultures, talking about different gods that rode on clouds, whether it's Baal or others that they looked at the skies as the gods ruled from the skies or the heavens. So the cloud motif is found in many different pagan cultures, and I believe it's picked up by the prophets in order to establish that there's only one true God, and that true God that we would call, the Lord our God, or if you want to go by the name Yahweh or Jehovah, that He is the one who resides in heaven. He is the one who controls everything and rides in the clouds in heavens, or sits in the heavens, and the thrones and all that. So I think Daniel is picking up on that language, being writing in a vision format, and describing the ultimate power and authority of God over all gods, and bringing in, talking about the Son of Man, referring into the Messiah, and then the thrones, plural, that will be set up. And this is what Jesus refers to when he's brought before the Sanhedrin, that you will see the Son of Man. And this, a lot of times, this was brought in as a judgment motif, that God establishes this, looks down, and will judge the nations, or even judge Israel. As so, I think Jesus brings that up in a way that they would have understood from Daniel's perspective, that this is a messianic passage. Jesus is applying it to himself. And this is where they thought for blasphemy, because he's putting himself in that, sitting on that throne, the more than one throne, and putting himself in that position of deity, and you could say. And so it's more of a call back to Daniel, judge motif found in other pagan religions, but again adapted in order to show that the God of Israel is the one true God above all, and that the Son of Man reflects that in the New Testament, of Him being that Son of Man who will establish those things. So it fits perfectly with the understanding from that first century perspective, how they would have heard it and understood it, specifically in that way. So again, looking
Do
all the
you
way down.
do you think that the cloud motif has any when he used that language, coming on the clouds of heaven, or when he comes in the clouds in Matthew 24, that also has any reference back to the Mosaic covenant and Mount Sinai, and God coming in a cloud and being the covering cloud by day? Do you think that has any relation to that language?
I think there's definitely a relation. It's used differently there, where God was in the cloud, was in there, and He was with them in that sense. And this is more of a vision of looking down, rather than. But it still has that connection, because it deals with the cloud. But God now resided in there, or He would be in the temple, and the cloud would come in the temple and cover it, and He was in there. So I think this goes beyond that. That this is more. That's more of for them to see and experience God in the cloud, where this is more of a vision discussing the messianic era of what the Son of Man will do. And at the end of it, it talks about His dominion is an everlasting dominion; it will not pass away, and His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, referring to the messianic kingdom. And I think the time that we can look at that as being established through our time frame, as well as when He returns, it'll be well established in a literal sense, no longer in a vision, but when he returns, it will be put in full effect. So yeah, there's a connection, because I think, but more from the standpoint of how they adopted it from the heavens above. And Isaiah talks about that as well, and Ezekiel, and here in Daniel. But this is more of a messianic era, a messianic time frame. I think that's what. But yeah, there can be a connection of the cloud, of how they saw God with them in the cloud.
So
But
his
now, yeah,
presence, basically, that God's
right,
presence was there.
right, and
Mhm.
that's how they saw it when He came to the temple, when he traveled with them. He was there with them, and his presence was with them and went with them. And this, I think, and so this is more of a different. There's a connection, but I think it's giving a different description of using the cloud understanding in a different way.
Okay, great. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Again, I really appreciate your time. We can talk again offline about hooking up for a couple other things. And
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you just kind of want to leave us with, or anything else that you just want to mention or say, or
Well,
promote your
yeah,
own? I mean, you already
well,
promote your
yeah.
channel, but
I mean, if you, yeah,
so,
and hopefully you leave a link, but they can search me out on YouTube. If they put Dr. Al Garza, you can Google. I'm at academia. I have a lot of papers written in academia. I have books on and have a book on end times, kind of what we've talked about here. I also have a section there that Kenneth Ditcher Jr. Put in my book as well. He allowed me to put in a couple of his articles. But yeah, I've written a number of books on this topic. I have commentaries on different areas, even in Revelation. You can find them all on Amazon. If you go to my website, dralgarza.info, you can find more about me and the links and all that. But yeah, I have a different ministry right now. I'm focusing more on, we have in our possession over 4,000 Hebrew New Testament manuscripts that we are translating and working on that come from the early Middle Ages to mid to late and even some before that. So we are working on translating them because these are manuscripts that have never been found or never been studied or looked at because they were thought to never exist. But now we have them. So there's even a really good Hebrew revelation that seems to be more in line to how it would have been written originally in his copy, which it gives really great insight.
Is that the Cochin revelation?
No, there's different ones. There's the Cochin there's from India, and there's one from Spain. I mean, there's different ones. We have a number of different revelations, and so I don't want to give too much, but we're working on different on translations of collating them.
Okay.
Because what we were doing, we were trying to collate them and just compare them and see their differences, just like we would do with the Greek manuscripts. No different. We're doing the exact same thing with these Hebrew texts and then we also look at the Greek and say, how do they differ from the Greek? Do they give more explanation or in light to the Greek? Sometimes they do. Sometimes they fill in the missing gaps what the Greek might be missing. So they're really fascinating to read. So we're working on that, and that's part of our ministry. You can find on my website. But yeah, I mean, you just go to my website, Google my books on Amazon. You can, find me anywhere on here. But
yeah, and I encourage everyone support the Hebrew translation ministry. That's how I found him, and I really excited about what you guys are doing there. Yeah. So yeah, I'm excited. I want to see the other Hebrew one. So when you can release it, let me know because I want to check that one out.
Most definitely. I do have a new book out. My book that just got published, The Search for the Language of the New Testament. We just released that a couple weeks ago, and that gets into why we believe the New Testament would have been originally written in 3 languages, not just Greek, but have been Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and the translation. So we build off of what we know from the evidence of today, and these are strong points that I think most people miss because there's been a belief at some point in academia in the 18th, 19th century that Hebrew was a dead language and it wasn't being used anymore. And then we find out afterward from the Dead Sea Scrolls, oh, wait a minute, Hebrew is alive and well. So we bring about these misconceptions and these outdated theories of the New Testament being only in Greek. So we in my book establishes the foundation and builds on the early church fathers, Greek, Latin fathers, all the way down to the Enlightenment period, and all the evidence that can show that the New Testament has the Hebrew roots behind it in Aramaic as well as Greek. Wonderful. You can find that on Amazon.
I will definitely check that out because I already got your Revelation one, and so I will definitely check out that one because I'm very interested in the original.
That's really a really academic-based book. It's really dense and a lot of information, a lot of sources cited, and my catalog is in there for all the manuscripts we're using. So even the catalog I put in there so people can see what we currently have.
Okay. Is it worse than F.F. Bruce and not F.F. Bruce? Who was the other guy who was out of Yale that did the canon of recovering the text of the New Testament? That was a rough one. No, before him, he did he did the versions before him. Because I got him back from the 90s. Oh gosh. Anyways, those were pretty. Those were pretty dense. Yeah, I'll remember his name in a bit.
Yeah.
It's been a few years since I read that one. Okay, well, I will let you go. Again, I really appreciate your time, and but I'll shoot you a thing, and we can talk offline about how to support your ministry and do some other things. So
appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garza.
You too. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.